One of my bigger regrets is not meeting myself earlier. Now, to give context around that, you and I have heard Lazarus and other teachers mention the ego I, the self I, and it's just words. It's, me, right? But after meeting the self in my 40s, I understand the confusion as well as the distinction between the self and the ego. So I'm going to first go into that in more detail because it would have been nice to have someone go into that detail for me. And then I'll talk a little bit about how to have that experience. So the first thing to understand is identity. And identity consists of two parts, the I and the dentity. Now, the dentity is a pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being. It's a pattern. If it's a strong identity, it's an integrated pattern. It's like a well-woven rope. If it's a weak identity, it's a disintegrated pattern, meaning I think this, I feel that, I say this, I do that, and I don't really know who I am. I don't have a sense of being. It's just disorganized. And it's weak, not for some abstract reason, but if you take strands of a rope and you pull them apart to a very small level, you can snap the thread. And you go to the next thread and you can snap that thread. And you go to the next thread and you can snap that thread. And slowly, the rope breaks and falls apart because the threads are disintegrated. Now, if you take the same rope as a rope, you can pull all you want. It will never break because it's well woven, right? If I think this based on observation that is sound, referencing a large data set, and then I feel this based on that thought. And then I say this because I think and feel this. And because I say what I think and feel, it's also in alignment with what I do. And when you've got those four together, the sense of being is peaceful, right? The byproduct, the synergy of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing in a tight, woven, integrated rope is a peaceful identity. Right? I think this, but I feel that. That's not a peaceful identity. That's a discordant identity. Right? So I've got a strongly woven, integrated, cohesive pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, and doing. The way that I be, the way that I am in that place is efficient, right? It's very inefficient to think this but feel that and be in the middle. It's very inefficient. It's a tug of war, right? So there's a sense of grace, there's a sense of efficiency, there's a sense of well-being, there's a sense of harmony in an integrated identity. Now, that's the pattern, the dentity. Now, the I is what attaches itself to the dentity. The I is the one that says, that is me. I identify with that pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being. And the I uses usually a pretty simple, basic method of deciding whether to identify or not, whether to attach itself or not. Now, the I is the ego. The ego is the I. They're just two synonymous words. Now, unfortunately, I does not reference what is the smartest pattern or the most enjoyable pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being. What the I typically references is the past, right? So someone who regularly smokes, doesn't shower, stays up all night drinking, vandalizes the local neighborhood, and then ends up in jail. That's what they do. Well, why? Why did they do that, right? Well, often, I'm just copying, I'm internalizing dad's identity or my friend's identity, right? It's not referencing what's the best identity, because many identities or many patterns of thinking, feeling, speaking, and doing and being are formed before thought, before language, and before critical thinking is in effect. So a pattern starts, and then the I says, that's me. How do I know it's me? Because that's what I did before. You look in the mirror, and you don't say, is this the best pattern that I can imagine? You just say, well, is it like the pattern before? I'm thinking that thought, oh, I hate my mother. Is that me? Right? The ego, the I, has to decide, is that me? And how does it do that? Well, it looks in the past and says, yeah, well, I've thought that for, X number of years. I had a reason for thinking that, so that's me, right? Well, is it as enjoyable as saying, I forgive my mother? Well, that's not the question the I asks. The I asks, is that the pattern that I'm familiar with, right? The familiar pattern originates with the family. Is it the pattern that I relate to? That's me. I do that. That's me. So you have those two parts, the pattern and the I that says that that's me, right? That turns it into an identity. It's just a pattern. If you say, well, that's just some thought I thought, but it's no big, it's just one of many possible thoughts I could think. It's not an identity. What makes it an identity rather than just identity, what makes it an I pattern rather than just a pattern, is that I believe in it and I attach myself to it. And I hold on to it because every ego wants to know what it is, who it is. And once it has decided that, wants to hang on for dear life. Because on the outside of the identity is the unknown. And the unknown is extraordinarily big. And the ego, the I, is extraordinarily small, right? So I want some solid pattern that I can rely on, that I know that's me, right? Because the I, its fear is of death, right? Of not knowing who or what it is, of being out of control, and of ceasing to be. That's the fear of the I. So this is me because this is who I was, and it must have been good because, I chose it, or dad chose it, or that's what we do in this country or this family. And so that's me. So this is what we typically call me. Like for most of my life, when I've said, who's me, I'd say, well, I think these thoughts, I feel these things, I have these sensations. That's me, right? This is my body, that's me. And because the I is attached to knowing itself and all of that, it holds on to it, right? And then it makes it me, right? It recreates, and then it re-identifies with the pattern it creates. Or maybe it makes a little change here. Maybe I decide that I am a scientific person, so I will change based on data, right? My country told me that science is a good thing. I learned it in school. Said, okay, that's me. I'm a scientific person. Scientific people respond to the data. And so if certain data presents itself, then I will respond because that's who I am. This is the ego, the I identity. And in a materialistic culture, in a highly verbal culture, in a highly linguistic culture that's focused on mathematics and words, that is the complete definition of who I am. And it is a very vulnerable definition. First of all, it's vulnerable to cultural corruption or cultural incompetency because you primarily get it from your culture. It's polluted or corrupted by language because your culture always focuses on certain things but ignores other things. Every culture does this. You just have to live a year with interest around different parts of the world, and you will say, why is that the response in the US and that's the response in Thailand? Why is everyone doing this here and everyone is doing this over here? Why? I mean, it does. And the answer is, of course, because everyone's doing it. That's what makes it a cult. Right? A culture is a cult of everyone deciding to largely eat the same things, work the same hours, live in this location, talk this language. Everyone agrees this is the polite thing, that's the rude thing. Why? Well, that's just the way it is, right? Just the way it is, right? That's what makes it a cult. And that's how the identity, the pattern, forms as a cult. Right? I think this because that's what I think, because that's what I thought before. Right? This is the food I like. Why? Because that's the food I like. Well, are you going to try it? No, I'm not going to, because this is the food I like. Right? So it's a self-referential pattern in many ways. So that's the ego, and it's very vulnerable because there's often very little logic behind the identity. The data is often lined up against the identity. You would be better off if you stopped drinking. You'd be better off if you didn't hang out with these people and hung out with those people. You'd be better off if you studied rather than watch TV. But I don't care. I'm going to do what I do because that's what I do, right? Says the identity, right? Says the cult, right? The cult of ego, the cult of family, the cult of culture. They are fractal representations, microcosm, macrocosm of one another. And they're very fragile because all egos die, all bodies die, all patterns change, but an insecure ego, a traumatized ego, which is normal in a traumatized cult, is constantly frightened of change and being out of control and dying. And that's the whole territory of me, I. That's what you and I thought we were, right? Even the esoteric thoughts of I'm, a divine being, or I'm part of God, Goddess, all that is, or any number of philosophies, I think I'm those thoughts, right? That's who I am. I think those thoughts because Lazarus said so, or because this philosopher said so, or I like this person and they think that. That's it, right? Now, none of this is the self. Right? None of this is the self. It's the I and the identity. It's the I and the pattern it attaches itself to. Now, larger than that, and this is, and you know something is larger than something else when it's witnessing it, right? Because you can't witness something from within, right? You have to be outside of it in order to witness it, and you have to be bigger than something in order to witness it. Now that's, as I think of that, you know, there's some ways that that's true and there's some ways that isn't, right? You can go out in a spaceship and witness the planet, but you're not bigger than the planet, right? But you do, in a certain sense, have to be bigger than the planet in the sense that you have to be separate from the planet in order to witness it. You could also say you have to be connected. You have to be separate and connected. You have to be outside of it to witness it, but you also have to be connected through sensory perception and time and space in order to witness. So you have to have a certain sense of detachment or objectivity, but you also have to remain connected, right? If you cut off all light, all time, all space between you and the earth and you're out in that spaceship, you're no longer connected, so you can no longer get data, right? Data has to flow through your senses, through a relationship, a relay of energy, which means you are connected, even though you're outside, right? And so you have a little bit of a paradox there. Well, the self, in a simple term, you could say is the witness of the pattern. So the I identifies, holds on and says, I am the pattern. This is my thought, it's mine. The I witnesses the thought and witnesses the ego. The self witnesses the thought, witnesses the ego. And says, my ego has attached to this thought. Right? The ego has a thought that it is attached to. Right? There is that thought there in the mind, in the brain. That's there. But the self, the difference between the I and the self is whereas the self defines itself and attaches itself tightly to the thought, to the feeling, to the action. The self witnesses the thought, witnesses the ego's attachment to the thought, witnesses the probability field for many different types of thoughts, witnesses the possibility field for even more types of thought, and just says, the self is neutral with a warm and nourishing energy. Right? Warm and nourishing for the ego, warm and nourishing for the probability field, warm and nourishing for the possibility field. The self is neutral. So it has no attachment to, got to have sex with this person and not that person, right? And I've got to do this. That's I. I have to do that because that's the way it is, right? The self witnesses. There's a thought there that says I have to do this with this and I can't do that with it. There's a thought there. Any other thoughts out there? Well, there's other thoughts too. There's thoughts there, right? And the self blesses the ego I with its ability to attach and hold on to this thought and hold on and rush around doing this and this, right? The ego tends to be a bit frenetic. But the self has a calmness. The self has a peace. The self is bigger than the ego. The ego is born out of, it's an instrument of the self. And the self is the state of ecstasy. You have stasis, that's a pattern, stasis, a pattern, the status quo. What's the stasis? What's the status, right? That's a pattern. It's solid. Why is it solid? Because it keeps doing the same thing. That's not solid. That's solid. A pattern is solid, right? So the identity is solid. The ego is always looking for something solid. Now, ecstasy is outside of the solidness. The self is ecstatic. It's not solid. It is, right? And it is in the birth. It is in the death. It is in the growing. It is in the dying. It is in the up. It is in the down. It's ecstatic. The self is present. The self is there. The self is beyond language, right? Because language takes little patterns of energy and boxes it up and says, that's that, right? The self isn't bound by that. It's on the outside of that. Now, my ego is all worked up at this point, right? Got to go check on the cooking, got to do this, got to do that, right? This is very uncomfortable for the ego to be in presence with something that's much bigger than it, that's not stable and solid, that can't be controlled by the ego. So that's the word distinction, right? But it's meaningless, right? You can read 1,000 books, maybe you got a little bit of the energy, right? But the ego can't measure that energy, so could you measure that energy? Well, the words are not going to get you into that clear sense of self, but here are some steps that you might consider to explore the self. The first is IFS, Internal Family Systems Therapy. It does a really good job of navigating the territory. And you have to understand, Dane, that with massive amounts of childhood trauma comes massive amounts of attachment and frenetic activity, and all of that tends to obscure the self, right? So IFS therapy tends to unravel and resolve some of those loud patterns so that we can feel the self on the other side of all that noise. IFS therapy is what I recommend. I also recommend microdosing psilocybin mushrooms and finding your comfortable bandwidth, right? So what's a microdose? Well, you can look online on the internet. You can learn where to buy mushroom spores. Those are legal, right? You can learn how to grow mushrooms. That's legal. This can bypass some of the legitimate concerns about, participating economically or making someone else a criminal by buying from them, right? It's unfortunate that in our cult, transcendent consciousness is illegal in the sense that its most effective doorways, psychedelics, have been banned for completely unscientific purposes because the identity of a Richard Nixon, of a control freak government, right, can't have its citizens freely thinking and exploring, right? Just as the control freaks in any family or any individual can't just let people explore and know things, right? It's got a system to maintain. I've got identity to control and maintain, right? And so ecstasy, the self, transcendent experiences, let's just make them illegal. Well, then, the biggest threat of the ego, of losing its stasis, right, is calm down, right? So that has to be worked around and understood, right? Why do paranoid egos behave that way? And then in my day, right, in your period, there's the whole taboo media blackout and propaganda campaign against medicine and consciousness, against plants that induce ecstatic states, which just fuels billions of dollars into illegal cartels, right? Because people have sought transcendent experiences throughout all cultures of human history, right? And so some ego identity of a narrow-minded government doesn't stop that seeking. It just pushes it into the underground and makes everything less safe and more expensive. Right? So in my day, they're starting to realize that, right? Well, why is it that it is illegal to grow a mushroom in your own garden and eat a bit of it in your own house? Why exactly is that such a crime against humanity? But it's fine that we abuse our homeless and do any number of absurd and crazy things. And so that's starting to shift. Good news, right? Things eventually go forward. And if you do grow like a psilocybin mushroom, psilocybin cubensis is a good place to start, and reading lots of literature about it is a good place to start. Well, you can grow a mushroom, dry a mushroom, powder it up, and weigh it. And, in my experience, between 175 and 275 milligrams on a scale, which you measure, is a good blurring territory to start being aware of the self without any psychedelic effects. No flashing lights, no visions, nothing like that. Just a little bit like, there's some part of me I'm a little bit more aware of that's normally covered in all that noise of repeated frenetic patterns. I'm a little bit more aware of that, right? It's not and so in that territory you can begin. I suggest going very, very slowly, right? Very, very cautiously, and look at what's gone wrong. Understand that 10% of people have horrific experiences because they don't get the dose right, they don't travel this terrain carefully, they don't take care and respect the territory. It's a very, very vast territory inside. Right? So that's one thing. Breathing is another. You can form ecstatic experience by rapidly and regularly breathing for 20 minutes. Right? You can feel wonderful, effortlessly, for free. Right? So that's another good place to start. And you can do chanting. Right? You can do chanting. And be in stillness in various forms of meditation. So this is the doorway into the self-I. MDMA, be very, very gentle and careful with that. I would do that maybe after some IFS work, right? And very low doses, 30 milligrams. It's enough. And create a sacred space around it to have some of those experiences of meeting yourself. That's the part of you that is outside of the system of your own fears, thoughts, and culturally indoctrinated beliefs. It's very important one way or another that you get a sense of who you are, and do so in a way without totally freaking the ego out and terrifying it with some massive dose of LSD or some other thing that the ego doesn't know how to deal with that, right? It knows how to deal with fear because we've always been scared. It doesn't know how to deal with ecstasy, right? So be gentle with that, but understand that that is a marker, right? Transcendent orgasm is a marker, an experience that is vastly important and just dishonored in our culture, but so is the transcendent experience of actually meeting yourself and then developing a relationship, a relay of energy where you spend 30 minutes a day is enough if you spend that with yourself. 30 minutes a day can add 500% to the quality of your life and triple the intelligence of your decisions so that your outer life actually has, a higher level of well-being associated with it. So I'm really excited for you, Dane, to have this experience of meeting yourself. The self in every human being is magnificent. And it is transcendent. It transcends language. It doesn't fit into the little boxes that form the identity that the I attaches itself to. It's bigger than that. It's bigger than that. And that's really what it's all about. I want to just take a moment, Dane, and let you know that without question, who you are, the self, is beautiful, is good, is true, is as close to God, Goddess, all that is, as you're capable of imagining. Of course, God, Goddess, all that is always vastly bigger than human imagination, right? But it's as close to that as you can imagine. It's the gateway. It's your connection to the divine. And there are defenses, I defenses, ego defenses against having that experience. There are misapprehensions based on cultural programming, whether it's the religions or the governments that really do not want you having a transcendent connection to who you are, right? Because that's the point when you are no longer controllable by your own fear because you don't believe your own fear anymore. It is a tremendously liberating step. So my greatest wish for you, Dane, is that you get there before I did. And as a result, right, transcend the reality as well as the identity that I experienced today.